Not like we have a litmus test about real estate. I mean, I'll come back to this theme that 95% of the time what's good for the city is good for the real estate industry.
Welcome to another edition of Coffee Talk. I'm Erik Engquist at The Real Deal, sitting in for our publisher, Amir Karangi, and I'm happy to be joined today by the president of the Real Estate Board of New York, Jim Whelan. Welcome, Jim.
You got it, Erik. Good seeing you.
So the state legislative session just ended, and we're going to get to that. But first, I want to talk to you about what REBNY is doing these days, but particularly, who are the members you're essentially representing? When I think of REBNY, I think of developers, I think of landlords, and I think of residential brokers. But is there more to your universe than that?
The easiest way I've been able to find to explain REBNY is to sort of break it into two parts. We're essentially a chamber of commerce for the brokerage industry, both commercial and residential. So run continuing education, deal with ethics and arbitration, networking events, awards. What's different on the residential side is we run the closest thing in New York City to a multiple listing service, the residential listing service. And then the second part of REBNY is, for lack of a better way of putting it, we're the advocacy arm of big real estate in New York City. So we have many of the large commercial residential developers and owners. And then, sprinkled in there, we might have some architects and law firms and stuff like that. But that's the basic structure of REBNY. I took over July 2019, right after the approval of HSTPA and just a few months before the onset of the pandemic. And, my priorities have been, and I'm sure we're going to talk about this, particularly with the challenging political environment, number one, to really focus on data and have data drive policy. And, I've been blessed to assemble a great team. And I think when you speak to folks in the industry, they'll acknowledge how strong my team is. And data has been very helpful in driving some of the, policy conversations we've been in. And then number two, and I think we'll talk quite a bit about this, but the idea of coalition building, that things have changed substantially for this industry in this city over the last 2 or 3 decades, and it requires going about things differently. And coalition building is sort of a key part of that.
Right. There was a time when famously one of your predecessors, Steve Spinola, was sitting in the office of the head of the state Senate writing the rent stabilization bill. Like these days, that doesn't happen anymore. So coalition building, because REBNY can't do that kind of thing, and in fact was demonized by its enemies as big real estate, and therefore should not be trusted to have be anywhere near our legislators. So by coalition building, you're talking about sort of partnering up with other folks who maybe are better regarded by our lawmakers, but collectively doing something that works for everybody?
Well, no, let me take a historical perspective on it first and then sort of come back to your specific question. The way I put it is, if you go back 2 or 3 decades ago, I think real estate in New York City was in a position to single-handedly stop something or possibly single-handedly make something happen. A few things have happened since then. The political rules of the game have changed. Term limits, campaign finance reform, the limitations of LLCs to be able to contribute. That's all sort of changed the political playing field. Number two, for the demonization of real estate, it largely comes down to one issue, which is housing, right? I've made this point to members, like if you were to go to survey, bad things written about real estate locally, it all largely centers around housing. And, that's for a few reasons. Is one, we're running out of land, right? New York is different than a number of American cities. It can't expand outward. It can only expand upward, right? This has been only part of the real challenge about tackling the housing supply issue, which is really at the crux of many of our housing problems. It's become a more and more contentious issue over time. So, it's natural for the fall guy to be the owner, to be the landlord, to be real estate. You layer on top of that, a very far left socialist way of thinking in this town, that one of its tenets is to be very anti-private property, private owner, all sort of leads to that. So, it's required a different way of going about it. The thing about coalition building is it really helps make the point that it's just not about real estate's bottom line, that there are broader policy issues at stake that are worth noting and worth taking into consideration.
Right. When I think about housing and why that is driving all of this, you think about, number one, the cost of housing. People blame real estate for housing being expensive in New York, and economists would say, no, it's because demand has outstripped supply, and therefore people are bidding up what housing is available. And then secondly, we have a huge rent stabilization regime, which means almost 1 million units have limited rent increases every year. And if operating expenses exceed rent increases, you're going to see a deterioration in the quality of the housing stock. Often landlords get blamed for not maintaining their buildings. And no one wants tenants to live in substandard conditions. On the other hand, if there's not enough money to keep buildings up, they will decline. So I think those are two main issues. And then we'll talk about brokerage also, but people don't like paying brokers' fees to rent a unit, and that has become a very contentious issue. So those are three things that sort of you've been fighting, against, and to some extent, like, what can you do when you want to make this about data, but politics is such an overwhelming force. How do you come back? How do you have data conquer the political forces?
So forgive me, I caught two of the three things you listed. One was rent stabilized stock. The other was broker fees. What was the third one?
The fact that housing is as expensive as it is, and then you have NIMBYism, which of course is everywhere. Like if you're going to build something that's taller than the building next door, people are going to be upset. But generally speaking, housing is expensive in this city, and a lot of people think it's because the landlords are just charging too much rent.
Right, but let's take them one at a time. Because I think two of the three definitely come back to the issue of data. One in terms of the cost of housing, and you've been one of the preeminent writers on this topic, but it's really impacted by supply. I mean, it is a supply and demand business. We saw that during the pandemic when people left town and rents went down. It's been well documented, and I think we've been at the forefront of this and documenting through data about what an undersupply of housing we have in the city and how we have not kept up with the need to produce. I spoke at a Citizens Budget Commission event the other day and talked about how, prior to the pandemic, the situation New York was in was managing its successes. And one of the challenges we've had in terms of managing our successes was the dramatic increase in population in New York since the 70s and 80s and not producing the housing to accommodate that. I think you're seeing a much more rational and thoughtful conversation about that publicly because you're seeing a lot more data out there to talk about it. Now, is it perfect? But I think it's going in the right direction.
Yeah, I'm wondering how that narrative changed, because I definitely have sensed a change in the narrative. It used to be, maybe 10 years ago that development was blamed for rising prices when in fact development was, adding the supply that was needed to bring prices down or at least moderate prices, and now we're at the point where most people acknowledge that we need more housing. And that's not really a fight anymore. The question is how to build it, what kind of housing to build.
And what policy decisions do you take into account, right? I think it's becoming more and more widely acknowledged that the problem with 485X, particularly in creating larger buildings, it was the decision to create a deal around the cost of construction labor that doesn't pencil out, right? And that's something that lawmakers are going to have to take head on moving forward in the future.
Let's talk about that, because that is crucial. Almost all multifamily development in the city is done with a property tax break. For a while, that was demonized by real estate's opponents as a giveaway to big developers. But the fact is, property taxes in this city are so high that projects, even if you got the land for free, often don't pencil out because the property taxes are so high. Therefore, the government provides a property tax break of as long as 40 years now to developers who build multifamily housing. That said, 485X has inspired a lot of criticism because along with the property tax break, the legislature layered on a wage floor, which kicks in at 100 units and can require a minimum wage of as much as $72.45 an hour for construction workers. So therefore, almost no projects larger than 100 units have been proposed under this new property tax break. And of course, you can't build without it. So that means we're really getting no projects larger than 100 units unless they are completely subsidized.
You said that very well. And to bring it back to the concept of data, I'm going to use a corollary, which is math. And this was a point we made to city and state lawmakers last year. We were the only ones putting forward pro formas that spelled this out in dollars and cents, but math just doesn't pencil out, which is why no one's going to build. And it's actually why I have hope that this will get resolved moving forward, because it takes it away from the ideological and puts it in a language, math, that I think results in a lot less disagreement. So let's draw the contrast with rent stabilized housing. There isn't public consensus about how many vacant units there are out there. It's striking the lack of data out there to inform a public conversation about the state of rent stabilized housing and where it should go. One can't go out and figure out how many MCIs and IAIs are being done on an annual basis by zip code or political jurisdiction, what the cost of those MCIs and IAIs are, how many have been accepted, how many have been turned down. And what's a little frustrating is, this information is all within the possession of the state's housing agency, DHCR. And we've made the point that they really should put that out, so that this is not an ideological conversation of left or right, but it's about dollars and cents, and it's about data and where you want to go.
You're saying the state is actually hoarding, keeping secret data that is essential to this debate.
Well, you're using those words, but the bottom line is, we've been through this ad nauseum, and we've had the conversations, and we can lay it out in black and white, but this data is collected by the state, and they're in the position to put it out.
Okay, for those not familiar with the acronyms, MCIs are major capital improvements. IAIs are individual apartment improvements. Landlords, building owners, can file for those improvements and then recover the cost by increasing rent-stabilized rents. That's the essence of the whole program. What happened in 2019 with the HSTPA, the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act, is that the rent increases were so severely limited that you really couldn't do much work at all and expect to recover those costs. So therefore, anytime a unit became vacant that needed a tremendous amount of work, $80,000, $100,000 worth of work, it just didn't make financial sense for landlords to do that work because they could only recover $15,000 from the IAI program or the MCI program if you're doing a building-wide improvement. So there was a slight tweak to that. The legislature made it $30,000 instead of 15, but that didn't really solve the problem in your view, did it?
No, and we were quite clear about that in dealing with state lawmakers last year. That would be, I was going to say inadequate, but that doesn't do justice to how far short it fell.
Right. If you have a unit, what I'm told by landlords, if you have a unit that needs lead abatement, that has asbestos, and all the regular, plumbing and sort of gut renovation that you have to do for a unit that may have been in one tenant or one family for 70 or 80 years, that's going to be $120,000, $150,000. To recover that by raising your rent $83 a month, which is what you're allowed under the law, it would just take decades and decades, and therefore no one does it, and the units stay empty. Despite this problem, no one has actually been able to make an accurate count of how many of those vacant units there are. And why is that exactly? Because several attempts have been made. We've heard 20,000, we've heard 80,000.
But I just laid it out to you a few moments ago. DHCR is in a position to put out data so that you'd have a public discussion to really narrow in on the universe of buildings that are vacant.
Okay, but landlords are required to report their vacant units every year. They're required to register all of their rent-stabilized units.
Right.
Why can't you just take those numbers I mean, are those numbers trustworthy or?
No, but those numbers are sent to DHCR.
Oh, and they're not aggregated and released, is what you're saying.
They need to be released, right? Aggregated. And
What is your?
I mean,
what is your sense?
one of the things, and yeah, by the way, it's just not limited to the industry. I mean, we were shocked to find this out, just in the past few years, and we've attempted to address it. Is at Rent Guidelines Board, there's a lag in the data they deal with, right? So this past year, I think they were basically dealing with 2022-23 data, 2022-2023 data. So we've started a practice with SPONY to reach out to members to get more recent data, the most current data from their forms, and share that with the Rent Guidelines Board in an attempt to have more current data. Rent Guidelines Board itself has problems accessing information from the state's housing agency.
Even when, and SPONY is Small Property Owners of New York, even when the Rent Guidelines Board has data, it doesn't always follow the data in terms of the rent increases that it allows each year. And that's what I mentioned before about politics sort of overwhelming data in this housing debate that we have in New York City. For the last 10 years, the Rent Guidelines Board increases have been below the rate of inflation, which means essentially they have been cutting rents 10 years in a row. Yet the mayoral campaign, which we'll talk about, has had one of its major features is this call to freeze the rents, when in fact rents have been going down. So that tells me your narrative is not out there at all.
A few things. I'm glad you brought up about RGB versus expenses, because you had talked before about the unwillingness on an economic basis not to proceed with IAIs and MCIs. But the problem has gone well beyond that for the reason you cited, which is RGB not keeping up with yearly expenses. So, I mean, you all have written about it. We have some members who are in this situation, but, they're turning to their banks and looking to give them the keys of the building, right? Because it's just not sustainable.
The banks don't even want some of these buildings, do they?
Yeah.
I mean, what would they do with them?
Losing
money.
In response to your question, I mean, there's an ideological belief, not rooted in fact, not rooted in data, particularly still among elected officials in Albany, that HSTPA was a crowning achievement. Mm-hmm. That came up last year during the whole discussions about negotiating sort of the big housing deal that got done, which, as you cited before, there was a lot of dissatisfaction about the outcome when it came to rent-regulated housing, but we were running into this ideological roadblock that HSTPA was still something to be proud of, versus something that's really detrimental to a significant portion of the rent-regulated housing stock in New York.
Well, for the most ardent backers of the HSTPA, it was a crowning achievement because their sole goal was to limit rent increases, and there's no question that the law did that. And we could talk about its effect on buildings' finances and owners' ability to maintain them. But if your primary goal is holding rents in check, that's what the HSTPA did. It prevented almost entirely deregulation of units. So it kept the 900,000 or so units in the system permanently, whereas it used to be a few, tens of thousands could be deregulated each year and returned to the free market. So how do you counter that? This notion that it was a success and therefore we shouldn't change it because it has accomplished its mission of holding rents down.
I think it's a few things. Is number one, I just keep coming back to this. You got to start making an empirical case about what the downsides are, which is why it's important to get that data out there. Also, I think given where conditions of some of these buildings are going, I think one's going to be able to start showing it graphically, visually, about the condition of some of the stock, and not only individual units, but buildings and soon-to-be neighborhoods. And it's unfortunate it's going to have to take getting to that stage, but unless there starts to be a change in the philosophy of some of the folks who hold office, that's probably what it's going to take.
The philosophy of some of these folks, and I'm going to name some names, like the chair people of the Housing Committee of the Senate and the Assembly, Brian Kavanaugh and Linda Rosenthal, when they see tenants protest about poor living conditions in rent-stabilized housing, they in my view, tend to blame the landlord, which is the whole point of the protest. Like, the housing is falling apart because the landlord is not maintaining it. When you talk to your side, the industry, it's like, we can't maintain it because we're not collecting enough rent. And maintenance is expensive. And therefore, we can't return vacant units to the market. So that's a lost revenue potential right there. And we have reached many of our mortgage loans before HSTPA passed, and then interest rates went up. So this combination of events has sort of wrecked the finances of these buildings. How do you get out of this mess? How do you counter the notion that deterioration is because of math and not because of landlords just neglecting their buildings?
I'm going to go back to a theme I struck earlier. In the area of housing, this is where it's been the most challenging over the past few years, but I think it's changing. But you need a broader base coalition than simply owners making the point that we are headed down the road when it comes to the care and upkeep and success of rent-regulated housing. So, just in recent weeks, and these are groups that we deal with frequently, and I think they're very reputable, and they're not in the pocket of real estate, but folks like the Furman Center, Citizens Budget Commission. I know Howard Slatkin of CHPC was out there recently talking about the whole issue of maintaining rental housing, both profit, nonprofit, on an ongoing basis. And that's what you're going to have to do, is sort of start to build this cacophony of voices about the need to take on this issue.
I've always felt that in order to get your message out, you needed to elevate nonprofit building operators, because when politicians hear that a for-profit building operator is not maintaining his building, then they tend to blame the profit, the profit motive. They're not maintaining their buildings because they want to make more money. But when you have sort of mission-oriented nonprofits unable to maintain their buildings, that presents a much more compelling case. Why haven't we seen more of these nonprofits step forward and say, this law is hurting us too?
No, I think you raise a good point. I just came from a meeting with an elected official where one of the members brought that up, that even nonprofit rental housing providers are running into problems. But you also have a strand of ideological thought out there, which is, let's just turn all the housing over to the nonprofits, which is just not a practical approach in this day and age. There's a need for housing. There's a need to maintain so much housing that you need both the private and nonprofit sector. In listening to you, I think to just take it on solely that way is a bit of a dodge, right? You have to deal up front with the need for the private sector to play probably a main role, or at least a key role in the housing market here in New York City, and what is required for that to succeed.
I think if you look at New York City Housing Authority, public housing, and how it has deteriorated over the decades, and now, in order to fix up these buildings, NYCHA has increasingly turned to the private sector to renovate and operate, manage these buildings. You think to yourself, well, isn't that an example of how the private sector is needed or is better than the public sector at operating buildings? And so why do we think it should be any different for rent-stabilized housing, which is private housing, which is not subsidized at all?
Yeah, sorry I'm going to give you such a short answer, but the reason is I wouldn't change a word in what you just said.
I want to talk a little bit about the politics of the city. We have a mayoral race. Actually, as we record this, voting is underway, early voting is underway, and the primary day is June 24th. The industry and your organization, REBNY, has backed Andrew Cuomo, the former governor, in a fairly crowded mayoral race, although it has seemingly largely come down to two candidates, Cuomo and Zoran Mamdani, who's a member of the Democratic Socialists of America. Tell us why you have backed so ardently, with so many millions of dollars, Andrew Cuomo, a governor who resigned in disgrace just a few years ago.
Yeah, I do need to correct you up front. REBNY doesn't make endorsements. We did not endorse Andrew Cuomo, not unique to Andrew Cuomo, but we don't make endorsement in races. With that said, I think the general sentiment is, reflective of much of the city, which is, we're still coming out of the pandemic. I think there's still a frustration in terms of getting New York back to where it was pre-pandemic. Record low crime, record high jobs, record high population. And when you look at the playing field of candidates, and I think this is reflected in polls, is the former governor is seen as the one with the most experience and the most leadership ability to lead the city forward in the challenges that need to be faced. His leading opponent, or purported leading opponent, who's, I think, run a telegetic campaign, but this idea that you can just give away everything for free, and for there not to be implications to that, is kind of hard to believe.
Well, I do want to clarify. I don't think I said that REBNY made endorsements, because if you did, that would be a bad move. It would be used against any candidate you endorsed.
Well, no, but you did say we endorsed Andrew Cuomo.
But you support, by financial contributions, candidates. And
we do, yeah.
Yeah, okay. And that is really all you can do, because there are only so many landlords. There are a lot more tenants than landlords. So realistically, you only have...
As a lifelong New Yorker, I've noticed that.
You only have so many tools you can use, and you can't really give that much money actually directly to campaigns anymore. You have to do independent expenditures, which you have done for Cuomo and also in some city council races that you're involved in. But what is you mentioned Zohran Mamdani's lack of experience and giving away...
Actually, I didn't get to that yet.
Well, you mentioned,
yeah, you
mentioned giving away things for free. That's kind of a very broad sort of description of his policy agenda. He wants to build $100 billion worth of social housing. What's the problem with that?
Listen, I mean, he's had very good TV ads. What I've learned from the TV ads is he wants to freeze the rent. He wants to provide free bus rides and, free childcare? So I think I was pretty accurate in my description.
Well, those are three things.
To sort of bring up, what you cited, and this again comes back to math, is like, lay out for a piece of paper how you're going to pay for all that social housing and how you're going to maintain all that social housing, and then the third piece, which you alluded to before, like who's running that social housing, right, and who's going to do it well, right? Yeah,
I think he wants to borrow $70 billion. Through issuing bonds. And actually, the state is not even allowed to borrow that much money at this point, because the bond cap is not large enough. So that kind of doesn't get mentioned in any of these conversations. The other thing I found disingenuous about his housing plan is that he thinks he can build, union-build housing for $500,000 a unit, when in our experience, it's $800,000, $900,000, even $1 million a unit, certainly not $500,000. It's kind of ironic that you actually can build market rate housing for $500,000 a unit, but he doesn't want to do that.
Right.
That said, Andrew Cuomo, in my view, is not all in on housing. He doesn't want to upzone many low-scale neighborhoods in New York City. So why isn't that more of an issue for the industry, people who are backing him?
Well, number one, I mean, we're probably not unique as an industry for this. I mean, it goes beyond just the industry's self-interest and, what's best for the city. I think it was Lou Rudin who said, 95% of the time what's good for New York City is good for the real estate industry. I think the polls are reflecting a yearning for someone, again, who's going to sort of lead the city, the ends of sort of the recovery from the COVID pandemic, get us back to a point where it was felt that the city was well run, and we're hitting some of those metrics that I spoke about before. The housing issue in New York City is very complex, and there are many levers and many solutions that are needed. Sure, we need more density. Great kudos to Dan Garodnick and the team at City Planning, who I think, he's done a stellar job since he took over in 2022. They're leading the charge on greater density. They're taking advantage of lifting the 12 FAR cap. There was the City Planning Commission approval of the Midtown South rezoning today. They're moving forward on the rezoning of Long Island City, going above the 12 FAR cap. We need to be capturing opportunities like that. And someday I hope they get to neighborhoods like mine in Belrose, where it was known as City of No. But there are housing opportunities out there where you should rezone along Jamaica Avenue and Jericho Turnpike. You're mere blocks away from the Long Island Railroad, and my sense is your successor will be writing about that someday, and my successor will be dealing with that, but there are plenty of opportunities before then.
All of these rezonings have to go through the city council.
Mm-hmm.
And that's been the case since the charter revision of 1989. On the whole, the council has not done a great job of keeping up with the demand for housing in New York City. It's almost been a NIMBY group in many cases, and that's kind of reflective of the constituents who yell the loudest in their districts. REBNY has tried to unelect several city council members. I wonder if you could just tell us which council members you want out and why.
There's just a few things there. You said that. I don't think it's a fair characterization historically to sort of pin it on the city council about housing shortages. I mean, I was involved in the rezoning of Hudson Yards, which was larger than the city of Boston. So, I mean, I created the rezoning of downtown Brooklyn, which was an additional 10 million square feet. That all went through the city council. It comes down to strategy, it comes down to need and the like. Just sort of get back to your question, we're getting more back into the political game. Had sort of taken a few years off from that. I mean, we sort of gave contributions and the like. There's 3 races we're involved in right now through an independent expenditure, Jobs in New York, that I go out and raise money for. Our approach on this is to know what you know what you don't know. So we go out and hire professionals to run these races. We're not looking for safe races. We're not looking sort of to go put a ton of money behind
for easy
incumbent.
wins.
Right.
Not looking for easy wins, and there's no reason to do that because those races are going to happen regardless of what the results are not going to change. But the competitive races that you're looking to change, which council members do you want out?
We're in 3 races now, and they're toss-ups. They're tough races, right? So number 1, we're involved in the 38th Council District down in Brooklyn, which is Sunset Park, Gowanus, Bensonhurst, South Slope. There's an incumbent socialist, Vilas. She's textbook socialist, defund the police, shares DSA's view of the Middle East, real estate, the boogeyman. There's a very, very talented individual running against her, Ling Yi. Done a great job fundraising. So, we're out there. We've been out there since late April with a very extensive ground game. Very involved, very heavy mailing program, digital program. So, based on what we're getting from the street, both what we've heard the incumbents say, as well as others, it's a surprisingly tight race. We'll see. It's always very difficult to beat an incumbent, but our attitude again with each of these races is to find a race where we can make a real difference in terms of who occupies that seat next time. And, being able to defeat an incumbent DSA city council person for the first time in recent memory, I think would be significant.
Okay, so that's one, and that's a key district because Avilas's predecessor, Carlos Menchaca, defeated the rezoning or stopped the rezoning of Industry City, which was a blow to the industry. And so that has historically been a problem area, that whole Sunset Park, Red Hook district, in getting more development there. So right. Avilas is one. Who are the other 2?
But again, I just want to come back. It's not like we have a litmus test about real estate. I mean, I'll come back to this theme that 95% of the time, what's good for the city is good for the real estate industry. It would be hard to point to a time in New York City's recent history when the city was doing well and the real estate industry wasn't, and vice versa, right? So, the thing is, looking for individuals who are going to be thoughtful, consider issues. We deal with such a breadth of issues at REBNY that we can't apply a litmus test, right? Because we might agree with an elected official on this issue over here, but we don't agree on that issue, right? And we need to continue to try to still work together.
I want to
right?
get to the FAIR Act, and we only have a few minutes left. So who are the other 2
The
council
other
members?
2 is District 21 in Queens. It's an open seat. It's LaFrac City, Corona, East Elmhurst. We're back in Chanel Thomas Henry. We think really has the strongest background in terms of coming from business background and community background. It's a multi-candidate race. And then the last one is we've gone in and started spending money against the incumbent in Lower Manhattan, Chris Marte, who, his record stands out for not chairing a committee. I don't think he's passed any legislation
I'm sure you're happy about that.
Definitely not good on real estate issues.
You don't want him passing any legislation.
Yeah.
He was the one who opposed the Soho rezoning. Opposed to Soho rezoning.
And I think he opposed the city of Yes as well.
Yes, he was like the one no vote in Manhattan, I think, against City of Yes, which is quite remarkable. And let's talk about the FAIR Act. This is the broker fee ban, if you will, although technically it's not a ban. The law says that if a landlord hires a broker, then the landlord has to pay that broker's fees. The fees cannot be passed on to a tenant. That law is now in effect. You sued to stop it. You failed to stop the law from taking effect. Part of your lawsuit is still alive, but what has happened since the judge ruled that the law can begin?
Well, I mean, number one, just on a legal basis, we've already started the appeal process. I've been in this situation before. It's tough to take on politically popular laws, but back in 2020, the city stripped the good guy clause out of commercial contracts, which was sort of very popular. We went out and found a plaintiff. Sued in federal court, lost in the Southern District, took to the Second Circuit, got it reversed, and out went that law. So, just in terms of where we are legally, we're moving forward on appealing, and we're going to look to be doing that pretty aggressively. What's happened since then, and your publication has documented it. What we predicted is coming true. In those situations where rents can be increased on market rate apartments, you're seeing the rents go up. Number two, listings are disappearing publicly, right? So what's going to happen here is it's going to be harder and harder to find apartments. And when it comes to market rate, tenants will be paying much more in terms of rent, which will accumulate over time. It's really a reversal of where the housing market needs to go. I remember when I was looking for my first apartment back in the 80s, sort of walking up and down blocks on, Chelsea, Clinton, or Hell's Kitchen at the time, looking for the signs outside buildings to see if there were any apartments available, because what else were you supposed to do? And we may not literally be going back to that time, but we are going back to a time where it's going to be a lot harder to find a rental apartment in New York City.
One last point on the FAIR Act. I think you can make an argument that for tenants who move a lot, it's good for them not to have to pay broker's fees. For tenants who stay in one place a long time, it's bad because they'd rather pay a broker fee once and then pay lower rent for the rest of their lives or however long they're in that unit. So there's good and bad for tenants on that front. But the idea that listings are disappearing, isn't there a way that you could fix the law or tweak the law so that it's still easy to find an apartment?
Well, two things. I want to go back to something we talked about before, just to tie issues together, because it shows the complexity of the housing market. But, the other ill effects of the HSTPA is, number one, home ownership dropped dramatically in New York City, like new home ownership, because the inability to sort of convert rentals to condos, which was a great entryway into home ownership in the past. And then two, picking up on something you talked about, which is mobility. Like mobility, the issue got masked for a while because of the onset of the pandemic and people leaving and coming back. But what's pretty clear about HSTPA is it dramatically reduced mobility from apartment to apartment. So now you layer this on top of it, right? It's just going to make it harder and harder to find an apartment. With respect to your specific question, this is actually at the crux of the legal case, but the way the FAIR Act was redrafted was the mere publication of a listing is in a sense the impermissible act, right? So it would be very hard to sort of square that round hole that you just flagged about taking on the listings and making it easier to find listings.
Right. So if you're a broker and you list a unit, the law says you are now working for the landlord.
That's what's assumed, right?
Yes. And therefore, the landlord has to pay your fees. So in many of the cases, the landlords don't want to pay the fees, so they're not going to let you list that, or you're not going to list it because you don't want to apply a contractual arrangement.
Or they'll apply very, strict boundaries around providing listings to brokers and to what circumstances, what they can do with those listings.
Theoretically, the law should make mobility easier if you didn't have to pay a large broker fee every time you moved. But I think in New York City, when you have a 1.4% vacancy rate, where are you going to move anyway? I mean,
right, and then layer upon that, it's going to be harder to find listings.
So we need to have all available units listed, and we need more available units. ideally we need a vacancy rate of 7 or 8%,
Right. Which, by the way, I mean, just to go back, really gets at the crux of why the dynamics are at play that the FAIR Act was trying to address, meaning that if you had a more robust supply, the 7 or 8%, tenants would have more leverage. Tenants would have more choices. Brokers would have more choices as to who they'd want to do business with. And owners wouldn't have as much leverage, right?
We're going to have to pick up on that a year from now, and I hope you will come back and we can talk about what happened in the mayor's race and next year's state legislative session, because there is a lot still on the table, 485X and multifamily development being, I think, the big issue. How are we going to build enough housing to take care of this housing shortage that we have? But that is all the time we have for today. So I would like to thank our guest, Jim Whelan, the head of the Real Estate Board of New York, and all of our viewers. We'll see you next time on Coffee Talk.